right, good morning, everybody. We'll work on getting started here. So for dimension balance reports, you can use these to create like a summary style presentation of balances with dimensions and account values. So as long as you know what a dimension is, you should be comfortable with these reports. And that can be, the program, checkbook, funding source, employee, vendor, account number, item number, class. So there's quite a few dimensions and ways you can use this report. And unlike the general ledger report, the dimension balance is strictly a summary balance type of report. You do have options to where you can click into the general ledger. So we'll explore that soon enough here. But the whole point of this report here is to give us visibility into account balances by dimensions and how you choose to lay out the report. So let's get started. On screen, we're going to navigate to the general ledger. With the general ledger menu here, in the far right, we have the report section of the menu. In alphabetical order, we have all the reports available, and one of those is dimension balance. So this is where we're going to click to navigate to that field. If it's a report that you want to use more frequently, you can always click the gold star so that when you come up here, your list of starred reports are here. So if it's just stuff that you're using and don't want to have to deal with all the menu options, you can start to use that instead. And like with any Intacct report, the first section we usually see is the period of time that we're going to use. This one defaults to the current month and usually the current day that we're at. So the current month, the as of date says 6/20, so that means it's going to be the month of June. We can change the period of time either by choosing a different reporting period, changing this date, or alternatively, we can choose a beginning and ending date if we want a specific period of time and we don't want to go through the 100 or so options that are in the reporting period. So the choice is up to you to either use the top two selections here or these two. Both will never work at the same time. The bottom two here, if you use it, will override whatever's picked at the top. So for now, we're just going to do current month. In this report, we have filters that we can choose of the information we want to start to pick and limit the report to. It defaults to using our accrual book. So basically any posted revenue and expenses, if we're looking for that type of information. If we're using this to look at our cash balances, it's going to have all the cash that's been posted. Inside of this little button here is where we can add encumbrances. I'm not going to do that yet, so we're just going to look at what's actually been posted as an expense for this particular report. For the dimension balance report, we can choose the type of content we want to see. Actual information, budget, or both of that together. For the first report, we're just going to use actual. We then tell Intacct what account numbers do we want to see. This allows us to choose a range of accounts. So if I wanted just all of my employee expenses, I can start with all of the accounts that start with a 5, indicating that they're employee-related expenses. So any account within this range on what I'm selecting is what Intacct will return for information for us. If I didn't want to select a range, there was just different accounts I wanted to use and maybe they didn't fall inside of this range, or we just wanted specific accounts, not everything possible between those. We could click multiple accounts and say in this instance, we only wanted tribal employees and travel. We can just find the account and click add, and that would let us select just those 2 account numbers to get information about, rather than having to have all the others on screen. So once we've selected what we'd like, we click save, and that would allow us to pull information for just those 2 accounts, or however many we want to use. If we want all accounts, we can just pick that and leave everything else clear. Then every single account that you have activity for would appear in the report. Not just revenue and expenses, it would include cash, accounts payables, accounts receivables, stuff like that would be included on this report. The last option we have is account group. So you can come in here and select an account group. Like the period of time, there are hundreds of things to select from. You can scroll through and find what you want. More than likely, we're going to want to use the ones we're more comfortable with. So like our financial reports, when we run revenue and expense reports, if I type all and start typing EXP, all expense GL accounts would give us all of our expense accounts. So you wouldn't have to remember or figure out the range, multiple accounts, or all accounts. You could just pick that, and that's what Intacct will return for you. Same thing for revenue. There's all revenue GL accounts if you wanted just revenue. And then there's also all revenue and expense GL accounts if you wanted all of that together. So really there's a lot of ways here that Intacct lets you customize and pick to get a report that you want to see using a dimension balance report. For now, I'm going to use range and utilities for this report here. So our range is just the account 68100 through that, so that limits it to just the one. We're not using statistical accounts, so we're not going to worry about checkboxing that. And now for majority of users, we have to have a program in there. If you're limited to just the one program, enter your program. If you have access to multiple programs, you can choose the one or type all and choose all programs. That way, if you have multiple program access, you can see the report for all of those different types of combinations. The same thing works for checkbook. If you want to see just one checkbook, enter that one. If you want to see for all of it, you could type all and select all checkbooks. So I'm going to select just one checkbook. And then for funding source, this is up to you here. You can leave that blank. So if I left it blank here, it's going to give me all funding sources that are used that match this selection here, meaning all programs using checkbook 3. If you want just a specific funding source, you can type that in. Or if you want, like in this case, I'm doing general fund, I could use the parent funding source. So now this would mean this parent plus all of the sub funding sources that fall beneath that. And so that's what I'm going to do for this one. If there's a specific customer or group of customers, we can absolutely use that here if we were doing that search. If you're using a customer, we can do the same with vendors. So if there's a specific vendor we're researching, then you can select that vendor here. Same with employee, item codes, and class codes. If we leave them blank, that just means that all of them are potentially usable for this report. So I'm not going to select anything here. I'm going to leave it blank. And lastly, we can show the type of formatting we want to see out of this. So my report currently says that I've selected to use the funding source ID, the account ID, and then the vendor ID and name. So that's the information that's going to be shown in the report for the month of June using the utilities code. You can order this however you want. This tells Intacct this is the ordering that we want. We want to start with funding source ID, then use account as the next sorting. So if you use Excel and you sort multiple columns, this is the same type of hierarchy there. And the last part would be sorting by vendor ID and name. If you haven't used this field before, so maybe we haven't used the report, it's going to just be blank and say select. So when we click select, these are the different dimensions we can use in the report. And there's 3 options for each dimension. So if we started with funding source, we can use just the name if we wanted that, not the ID. The funding source ID and name, and then just the funding source ID. And the same thing goes for the account ID. We have name and ID separate, or if you want those combined, that's an option to pick. And then the same thing with vendor ID and name. That does affect ordering. So like the vendor ID and name, that's the one I'm going to use. And that means it's going to order the results by vendor ID. If you wanted it by name, so the alphabetical makes more sense, you could choose just vendor name. So I've got my 3 selections. If this is what you have, because this report is sticky, so it means it's going to remember what we selected here. We can always click add or edit and then make changes to what we want to use from available items, or if we want to click and drag on these things to change the ordering of them. How do we want this presented? So I have cascaded. I will look at that and I'll come back and do side by side. Subtotals, that's going to mean a subtotal for each funding source ID, and then a grand total for the total of all of this. And the last thing is retain year-to-date balances. Do we want to see the balances from before the month of June in this? I have that unchecked. I'm going to leave it like that for now. And now we can view this report. And so the first thing we'd see, this is the period of time the report is running for. We used current month with today's date as the as of date. So we can see clearly it's the month of June. We used funding source ID first, so that's the how it's going to sort. So alphanumerically, this is the first funding source in the combination we used, which was all programs, checkbook 3, and the general fund accounts. There's the account number that we made visible. We only have the one to use, so that's the only account we're going to see. And then here are the vendors used during the month of June so far. We didn't include year-to-date balances, so our opening balances are $0. So we're getting just specifically the 1 month of activity. And we get the subtotal for each funding source group. And when we use this, and if we print this to PDF, it'd look pretty presentable this way so that people can clearly see the separation between the funding sources. Easy to see how much is being spent with each vendor, how much each funding source is spending in this account number. And all the way down at the bottom, we get the grand total for all of this activity. So there are other things we can do here. Anything that's blue, we can click on the blue part and that takes us to the general ledger. It's to the detail of what's making up this information. So this $50.51, if I click on that, it's going to bring up a new tab. And so there's the general ledger for what that is. And we have just the 1 month selected, so we can see it's one transaction from June 6th, the $50.51. So if there was more activity, there's going to be more things listed here to tally up what that summary is on the dimension balance report. If we want to make a change to how this report looks, Maybe we don't want it cascaded like this so that it's separating all the funding sources. If I hit customize and we come back to how we build the report, we can go back down to format and say we want this to be side by side. And maybe we didn't like that there was no previous information, so we also want to retain year-to-date balances. We can checkbox that. And we can go back to view, the report changes so everything's bunched together. So if we're using this, like we're going to download this into an Excel, this would look a lot nicer in Excel. It's sort of more easier to read on screen than all separated. But now we can see there's the funding source, the account number, the vendor, still the month of June's information. So we can see current month, still month of June. But in the opening balance column now, instead of all zeros, we're starting to see where there's expenditures from before the month of June. And so this would be the fiscal year October through May 31st. Now we can see totals for the full year in the third column instead of just the period that we ran. And we can see that all the way down to still get the same monthly total for June, the total we've spent for all the way up until May 31st, and then the total now for the fiscal year. And so these are some of the options we can do. The current month or this reporting period, if we wanted to do this for the month of May instead of the month of June, we can leave current month there and change the as of date to a day in the month of May. So when I rerun the report, now we're getting information up to May 31st. And so the values here now change from the $3,000 total in June to $14,000 in May. And then this balance for the opening balance column goes through April 30th. And you want to be careful using these reporting periods. So for current month, there's that, but there's also current month to date. And that does affect the information that comes out. If we use current month and it doesn't say to date, that would mean no matter what day we use here, so if I change this to May 10th, and we run this report again, it's still going to give us the entire month of May. If we only want it to May 10th, we need to change this to current month to date. And when we rerun the report, now the period of time says 5/1 to 5/10. So it's allowed us to limit the information we're using by that combination of reporting period and as of date. Or with that selected up here, we can choose an opening day and a closing day. So April 1st to April 26th. And that overrides that top selection and only goes by the dates I put in. The way these columns works doesn't change. So this opening balance would be the March 31st balance. This period column would be April 1st to April 26th. And the closing balance are those two columns combined. If you have questions, you can still put them in the chat box or raise your hand, and you can be unmuted if you want to ask in the with your microphone. All right, the next report I'm going to do is basically just our financial report, our revenue and expenses. If you're using a life-to-date report and you use it from the Financial Report Center, that thing can take half hour, 40 minutes to run on screen if you're lucky and you don't get the error message that it's taken too long. Or you have to process and store and wait for Intacct to email you that the report is ready. We can run it here on screen and get information pretty quickly without having to wait an extended period of time. So if I use inception to date, and we'll do the current day, I'm going to delete this selection because I don't want to use those as the time. I want to do life to date, so inception, since we started using Intacct to date, so through June 20th. I'm going to include encumbrances in this one. So now I've got encumbrances in the accrual book. This checkbox tells me I'm combining both of those together. If I want to use actual and budget, I click that box. It should default to RST budget. You can click there. There's other options. So if you needed to see draft budgets, you can do that here. But we're going to stick with just the RST budget. If we want just one account or range accounts, we can pick that. I'm going to use the all accounts and account group function. So we'll do all revenue and expense general ledger accounts. We can leave the program selection as it is. I'm going to do the same thing. We're going to do all programs, checkbook 3 in the parent. You use your funding sources. And if you're using a life to date report, so whether it's a 638 report, ARPA funds, any of those things, make that selection here. We don't budget by customer, vendor, employee, item, or class. So I'm not going to make a selection there. We also don't budget by vendor, so I'm going to get rid of that. And we'll just go by funding source, ID, account ID, and name. We can choose how we want to see that, side by side or cascaded. So let's try cascaded, and we're going to get rid of retain year-to-date balances because we're using the entire life of the funds anyway. How do we want the budget to be compared? Do we want the first column to be budget and then the next column actual? Or do we want actual first, then budget? And do we need to see a difference between the budget and the actual? So I'll checkbox that. And this is a life-to-date report, including encumbrances and expenses. If we were going to run this on the financial report side, this is going to take a while. But now when I click view here to run on screen, as Intacct runs through this, it'll deliver us the report here momentarily. All right, so that's faster than I can get a drink of water. I have a life-to-date report on all of these different funds. So there's the parent fund, council, president's office, all the way through. As I scroll, we're probably looking at maybe 70 different funding sources that produced as a life-to-date report in just a few seconds, rather than having to wait 30, 40 minutes for a report to produce. And we get basically the same information from a life-to-date report. There's the combined budget for this period of time. For whatever reason, life-to-date reports for Intacct starts on September 28th, 2008 through today. So 16 years of possible information that just took a few seconds to produce. So there would be the budget for all of that period of time, the revenue that was received for that period of time, and the difference between those two numbers here. And you can see that on expenses, or revenue. If you don't want to see the report like this with all the different funding sources, maybe you want it combined into one so you can see the overall budget for a group of funds. If I go to customize and I get rid of the funding source ID, I don't want Intacct to show that, so that means it's going to show it all as one group here. It can rerun the report. Comes out a little bit faster since we're asking for it to produce less information. So instead of getting one funding source listed here and then the next one, all of the stuff gets combined for that group of funds rather than breaking it out by each funding source ID. So it's really up to you how you want to see the report come out, the ordering and how you want to see the dimensions displayed. All right, so those are the two things I wanted to cover in this. I wanted to make this a quick session. I didn't see any questions come in the chat box. Does anybody have questions about a dimension balance report that we've just done here?
Feel free to raise your hand or type the question in the chat box. Also, don't forget to answer the poll question before you leave. Tracy asked, can you run just the encumbrances?
Yes, you can. So if we wanted to see them, say, just for the current year, since previous year's encumbrances should have been cleared, we can change our selection from inception to fiscal current year. So I'll do current year to date. I can uncheck combine. So that means it's just going to use the selected area for encumbrances. If we left it at all revenue and expense general ledger accounts, we can leave that there, or we can just choose the one account or number of accounts we want to use. We'll stay consistent with what we're doing for program, checkbook, and fund. And then depending on what you want to see here, you can do that. So if we left everything combined and I click view, and start scrolling, we'll see the expense accounts that have encumbrances open. If we need to know more information about those encumbrances, so if we come back down to our formatting of the dimensions, right now it's just account ID. Let's say we want to add that funding source ID, and we'll make that first so we can get the report by fund. And we want to know the vendor ID and name. We can make that here. So now we'll see the balances specifically by the vendor. And so as I scroll down here, here's the account number, the vendors who have encumbrance balances. And we're using the budget still there. So it's saying no vendor, and then it's got an amount in the budget column. Well, we can see how easily we can get the balances by each vendor in an account for what's open for encumbrances. And then just like with anything else, it's hyperlinked in blue. So we could click on that to get more information about the encumbrance. So we can see this looks like we opened a blanket PO and I've made a couple of payments. So the balance still remains from the original $200 PO. Easy one since it was just one transaction.
And you guys may not be able to see what's opening up for them, but trust us, it's happening.
Oh, sorry, I didn't share that pop-up. So by drilling in, it gets you right back to the general ledger, but this time for encumbrances. And we can see it was one original request. The standard purchase requisition creates the encumbrance. And then we have these two different commitment releases. And so these are payments being made going out to SOBA. And the purchase order is still going to remain open until it's fully exhausted or closed. So I see there's a question on, is this being recorded? Yes, I am recording it. So once it's available, I'll email everyone the link.
And it'll most likely be posted on LJ's YouTube page. Don't forget to click that subscribe button.
And as Lynette says, it's a good report to run to close out POs at the end of the fiscal year. Yes, now is a great time. We only have a few months left of the fiscal year as to where you could run that and see your list of open encumbrances now, because there might be a few stragglers from the early part of this year that you might not be using anymore. And that'll help you free up budget as well. All right. There's no other questions in the chat box, and we're a couple of minutes after how long I wanted to go with this. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and just keep an eye out for your email. I'll send the YouTube link when it's available. Have a good day.